Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. For this week's video, I would like to go through the design of an N-scale layout for a gentleman in England. Now, this should have been a relatively straightforward design and should not have taken me as long as it did. But I had a couple of delays during the process. Firstly, I had a lot of trouble in getting the correct dimensions. There was just a breakdown in communication. And this is what I first thought he was describing, and some of the numbers weren't quite right. And also, Ellie passed away in the middle of the process, and that threw me for a loop. And it took me a while to get back into it after that. I just didn't seem to be able to concentrate on the layout designs anymore for some time. And I think this is actually the first railroad video that I have made since she passed. All the others that have been published recently were already finished and uploaded prior to December. So please bear with me if I don't seem completely with it. I am still struggling. Anyway, the customer wanted a fairly simple layout. He wanted a double track main line. He didn't really care much for switching, or shunting as they call it in England. Instead, he just wanted to watch long trains running through the landscape. So he wanted a double track main line with some low-level staging. Now, as I've already mentioned, I didn't get the room dimensions quite right the first time round. Eventually, he was able to correct my drawings. The movie screen is a lot closer to this long wall than I originally thought, hence the need for a lift-up section to be able to move it out of the way of watching movies. Now, this diagram still isn't quite right. It turned out that the 15-foot dimension that he gave me was not the wall length, it was the distance to the front of the movie screen. So there's actually a few inches extra in there, which can be used for scenery, but which weren't going to be usable for any track. Anyway, as I said earlier, what he wanted was just a simple layout to watch long trains running through the landscape. So in US parlance, that would be called rail fanning. In England, they call it train spotting. So here is what I came up with. I have a helix in this corner next to the refrigerator, a junction which will determine which way around the main loop the trains revolve, double track loop, a large but simple station. At one point we toyed with the idea of a separate goods loop, but it really just wasn't going to fit. The space available just wasn't quite large enough for it. Although I did later add a single goods lay-by loop in this area here around that curve. Note that instead of just putting 3 conventional double junctions, the one at the back leading up to the station is a flying junction, just to give us some more variety. In this version, I figured out the shape of the lifting flap, the extent of the access necessary, and I filled in the backdrops and showed how it can come forward here to allow access space behind it. He also has a magnetic roadway that he wanted to incorporate, so I've shown it here on this plan. Now it has 2 small turntables, one at each end, and one of them will be hidden under the station. This road out the back is just a dummy, just so that it looks right. And then at this end, I offered 2 choices. Either we could do the same thing with it hidden under the track, or we could just go through the backdrop and disappear into some trees. And he preferred that idea, so I changed that. And this plan also shows the goods lay-by that I put in there. That is about 8 feet long, and his passenger platforms are about 6 feet, so good for 12 coach trains. He did mention that he had at least one 12 coach train. Now note that this is for running British practice, so it's left-hand running, although it doesn't really make a lot of difference. And note how on the goods lay-by there are these very short spurs at the ends. Each end is a crossover instead of a single spur, because it's necessary to have the track points at both ends. That is standard practice. And here is what I drew for the staging yard. Since he wants to run a large variety of trains, I put in as many tracks as would reasonably fit, and I ended up with 13 of them. I spread the track centre slightly to 1.5 inches to allow for some finger room. So I've got 13 tracks ranging from 6 to 10 feet long, and there's a run-through track. So trains will come down the inner helix, run through, turn around, and be staged facing outwards ready for the return trip. And the uphill trip is made on the outside of the helix where the grade is slightly shallower. Note also how the helix has been enlarged from the minimum 15-inch radius. It's actually 18 on the inside and 19.25 on the outside. I wanted the curve to be as large a radius as possible because with an N-scale helix, finger room between the levels is always difficult to gain because of the sharper curves. Also notice how the two hinge sections don't quite line up. It's necessary to have the hinges further forward on the lower level than on the upper level. I will show you a drawing of how that works later on. Anyway, here is the upper deck with all the details filled in. As you can see, the track hasn't changed since last time, although the magnetic roadway has been rearranged so that it goes through the backdrop, disappearing into a load of trees. I've had the main line at the back also disappear in the trees so that we don't have too many tunnels. There's 2 tunnels at the front, but we don't need any more at the back. And the line from this junction around the back passes under 3 separate bridges. At this point, because of the curve, it's necessary to build a flying girder bridge. Quite rare, but also very interesting. It's unfortunate that it has to be hidden at the back of the layout. Now, he wanted the minimum of structures with mostly open country, so I just put a row of background flats along behind the station, just enough to represent part of a town and to give the station a reason for its existence. And then we talked about putting a stream and a couple of bridges on the hinging section. It doesn't have to be very deep, just a couple of inches below track level is all it needs to be. And again, we've got 2 different kinds of bridges. I suggested a through plate girder at the front where it's straight, and a triple stone arch around the back where it's on a curve. And in order to disguise the nature of the turnback curve here, I suggested a low hill on the lift out section with a cut through the back and plenty of tree cover, so that whereas the trains are plainly visible around the front where they cross over the bridges, they then briefly disappear from view before reappearing at the station. And the only thing I've done with the staging yard is to adjust the size and shape of the lifting section. Let me show you how that works. Okay, here I've drawn it in 3 positions: operating position, 45 degrees, and store position. Note how on the scenic level the hinges have to be at the tallest point so that nothing fouls, and also on the lower deck, bringing the hinges forward allows the lower hinging section to fold up into the space vacated by the upper one. Now, not shown on these drawings would be a pair of sliding bolts that would be necessary to hold them in the upper position. And also each one has its own leg, also on a hinge, that drops down under gravity and then rests on the level below, or on the floor in this case. And I suggested that you put pins or dowels protruding out of the bottom of each leg that fit into holes on the lower deck and in the floor, so that the legs don't inadvertently get kicked out from under the layout and cause a collapse. Now, as for the technical standards, I was able to incorporate a minimum radius of 15 inches, which is just about enough for his passenger trains to look okay, especially since there are generous easements on all the curves. I would have liked to have gone for 18 inches, but it just wasn't going to fit. This 7-foot maximum width at this end was the deciding factor. If I'd gone for a larger radius, I wouldn't have been able to curve back and keep the bench foot to a reasonable depth at this point, it would have just had to go diagonally across the room, and it would use up a lot more space than he was willing to give. You've probably noticed by now that this room is shared usage with the movie screen and the refrigerator. And since he's expressed a preference for the Pico Code 80 range, I was able to incorporate their largest radius of curves. There are 4 curved turnouts on the layout, 3 at this point and 1 at the other end of the layout on the staging yard. Everything else is their large radius turnouts, which have a radius of 36 inches, which is great for high-speed operation in N-scale. As I mentioned earlier, it's a very simple plan, a lot simpler than I normally do. It is quite a contrast from the layouts designed for intense switching that I do most often. Anyway, I think this is by far the shortest of the layout design videos I have produced to date, but I'm not quite sure what else I can say about the layout. So I will just leave you here. I'll sign off now, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.